During the summer of 1776, political leaders from across the American colonies gathered in Philadelphia to debate what to do next about the growing list of wrongs done upon them by the British Crown. Now, King George III had completely abolished colonial legislatures and had stationed a standing army in the American colonies, Britain's own territory, during peacetime. Now, our founding fathers ultimately decided to make one of the boldest and most important decisions in all of human history: to break away from the British Crown and to establish a government based upon the idea the government should protect its citizens' rights, not have an executive violate them. And we in 2015 face an equally serious threat of excessive executive power. In November of 2014, President Obama announced that he would suspend deportation for millions of illegal immigrants living in the United States. And so today we must confront the limits of executive privilege. In order to prevent further tyranny from taking root in the United States, we must first examine our founders' understanding of tyranny, before then taking a closer look at the stipulations they then placed in our founding documents in order to prevent tyranny. And we'll then delve into the progressive rejection of our founders' limits on the executive, and finally, discuss how education is the best way to restore a constitutional executive. Now, we must reaffirm our belief in our founding principles, for, as Edmund Burke said, kings will be tyrants from policy when subjects are rebels from principle. Now, our founders' experience with executive tyranny greatly informed their thinking about the role of the executive in government. Now, our founders would come to believe that the executive is something that is necessary, but also something that must be tightly controlled. Even before the Revolution, colonists greatly resisted executive overreach. In 1761, Massachusetts resident James Otis delivered a speech entitled "The Rights of British America, Asserted and Proved," in which he stated, "An original, supreme, absolute earthly sovereign must exist in and preside over every human society. It is originally and ultimately in the people." Now here, Otis encapsulates what our founders would come to think about the executive. There must be an executive in society in order to enforce laws and protect rights. But this executive must always be beholden to the people. And if an executive does not enforce law and protect rights, well, then something must be done. And on this note, our Declaration of Independence clearly lists the wrongs done upon the American colonists by the British Crown in the years preceding the Revolution. And King George III had either weakened or completely dissolved colonial legislatures, stationed a standing army in the American colonies during peacetime, quartered these soldiers in private American homes, forced taxes on the American colonists without their consent, completely abolished the English law system, and created an arbitrary government. And here, our founders saw the other and darker side of the executive. Now, if an executive stops enforcing laws and protecting rights, well, then he is no longer an executive. He is a tyrant. And from this experience with the executive, our founders crafted a constitution that melds the necessity for an executive with strict limitations upon his power. Now, our Constitution does create an executive office, the president, who has specifically enumerated powers that allow him to enforce laws, conduct foreign affairs, act as commander-in-chief of the military, and the like. But this president's powers are checked by the powers of both the legislative and judicial branches. In Federalist 51, James Madison writes that the interior structure of government must be arranged so that its constituent parts keep each other in their proper places. Now, what James Madison is telling us here is that the more moving pieces a government has, whether it's local government versus national government, House versus Senate, Congress versus the president versus the courts, the less likely that any one of them, or all of them combined, will be able to oppress. And this, our founders' solution to executive tyranny, wasn't simply the best solution for their time, it was the best solution for all time. Because our founders understood that power will always eat away at morality and self-control. But near the turn of the last century, a group of thinkers emerged who had re-raised the specter of executive tyranny in America. Now, the American progressive movement completely rejected both the founders' and Constitution's limits on the executive. One of progressivism's most prominent voices, Woodrow Wilson, called in a 1912 speech entitled "What is Progress?" for a more modern interpretation of the Constitution. Wilson stated, "All progressives ask for is to interpret the Constitution according to the Darwinian principle." Now here, Wilson sees social structures as constantly evolving, which makes our Constitution a relic of a bygone era that only hampers good government in the modern era, because modern government must be unleashed so that it can confront the great social ills of our time. Now, Wilson further compares governments to living creatures. In the same speech, he states, "No living creature can have its organs offset against each other and live. Now, government is a body of men with a common task and purpose, and there can be no successful government without the intimate cooperation of the organs." And here, Wilson completely undermines the Constitution's ideas of checks and balances and a balance of power, vital safeguards against unlimited government. Now, Wilson sets a dangerous precedent for both his intellectual and political successors, as he completely undermines both the founders and Constitution's limits on the executive. And now we find ourselves with a progressive thinker in our White House who brings about the great constitutional crisis of our time: unlimited executive power. Now, President Obama unites the desire for progressive government with social action. Our president has made many unilateral executive actions during his time in office. For example, President Obama unilaterally raised the minimum wage for federally contracted workers to $10.10 an hour. He's made over 28 unilateral changes to Obamacare, all after the law was passed, and even the Supreme Court balked the president's power grabs when they unanimously ruled in June 2014 that the president's recess appointments to the National Labor Relations Board were unconstitutional. But all of these events came before what was perhaps the most egregious disregard for the president's enumerated powers. On November 20th, 2014, President Obama announced that he would suspend deportation for up to 5 million illegal immigrants who have been in the United States for 5 years. Now, no matter this order's stipulations, the president has created new laws ex nihilo, disregarded old laws, and completely shredded the legislative process. In fact, our president has taken executive power so far that he threatens to become the king that our founders feared. And so we must ask ourselves, how can we stop this from happening again? Well, now that we understand our founders' understanding of tyranny and what modern thinkers and politicians have done to undermine it, we can discuss what we can do to help restore a constitutional executive. And we might ask ourselves, what can we possibly do? I mean, we're not politicians. What influence do we have? But there is something that we can do: education. In Abraham Lincoln's Lyceum address, he addresses the possibility of a tyrant arising in the United States. And in order to prevent this, Lincoln writes, "It will require the people to be attached to one another and to laws and government, and to be generally intelligent to successfully frustrate his designs." Now, we must, therefore, attach ourselves to laws and government by educating ourselves about them. We need citizens from all walks of life to be thoroughly imbued in the history and significance of our founding documents. Now, Hillsdale College, where we are gathered here today, plays an important role in that education. The college is dedicated to educating not simply those students who are here on campus, but also concerned citizens everywhere who care about limited and constitutional government. And an educated populace can then intelligently wield their right to vote to support candidates for political office from the state capitol to Capitol Hill that support our Constitution. And this group of intelligent and motivated voters is our last best hope against the forces of modern tyranny. For as Ronald Reagan said, freedom is never more than a generation away from extinction. It must be fought for, preserved, and passed on. Now, just as our founding fathers gathered in Philadelphia in 1776 to debate what to do next about a tyrant, so we must be equally concerned about the future of the form of government our founders left behind for us. So today we examined the great constitutional crisis of our time in unlimited executive power. And in order to do this, we examined our founders' understanding of tyranny, took a look at the stipulations they placed in our founding documents in order to prevent tyranny. We dove into the progressive rejection of our founding principles, and finally saw how education is the best way to restore a constitutional executive. Now, if we take up this challenge to educate ourselves about laws and government, then we can save our descendants from despotism and leave behind for them a form of government that is free, limited, and constitutional. Thank you.